fantasy short stories. Of Monsters and Mushrooms by Lesley Herron. Chapter 0, Following Bigfoot. It was no secret that people got lost in the woods. All the time, in fact. Eric wasn't very special in that regard, but most of them didn't do it while chasing interdimensional portals with an old plastic compass that only pointed north if he stood perfectly still on one foot, and a crudely drawn map he had cobbled together from the barely legible scribbles found in a stack of old journals belonging to a cryptozoologist. In that way, he was unique. He straightened out his back with a reassuring inhale of breath and continued to blindly plow along the path he had mapped out with a confidence he did not remotely feel. According to months of long nights poring over dusty notebooks and annotated maps in an old shed, listening to the rumors in town, and his own short treks into the woods, what he was looking for should be right here. Somewhere. Maybe. Assuming right here was the right here. "Oh, just face it," Eric grumbled to himself, adjusting the lamp attached to his forehead. "You're lost." So, night probably wasn't the smartest time for this journey, but he wouldn't wait any longer. He refused to see the continued broken state of his family. Whap! A branch whipped him in the face, knocking him from his spiraling thoughts. He cursed the forest for the 1,000th time that night, slapping the leaves away and readjusting his glasses. And then, as his eyes focused, he saw it. The glow from an interdimensional portal shone bright like a neon sign. He rounded a copse of trees to see a swirling vortex of green and blue hovering 6 inches off the ground and thrumming with a deep resonance. The portal itself wasn't an oddity. There were hundreds of them all over the planet, some of them even appearing in the earliest of human texts. How or why they appeared remained a mystery to this day, but each one opened to a different reality. And while the inhabitants of most of them were human, other sapient races weren't uncommon, including half his own lineage. Each portal was highly regulated by the many governments of the world, and if a country was lucky enough to have access to a realm with higher technology, they became an economic powerhouse. Everyone benefited from them. They brought all manner of inventions to their homes, from cell phones to shake weights. Even the more primitive realms offered opportunities of trade for natural resources, which meant undocumented rifts were a huge deal. Like being carted off to Area 51, huge deal if discovered. But he wasn't worried. The woods around it were so thick, the chances of anyone finding out where he was were... Eric! He jumped, startled to the point that he stumbled, tripped over a branch, and grappled with the rough bark of a nearby cedar tree to keep from falling face first into the glassy surface of the vortex. He whirled around, spotting a man running up behind him. His panic ebbed away as he spotted pointed ears beneath tidy black hair. He and his brother were the only half-elves in the entire state, maybe even the country. "Damn it, Vel! Did you follow me?" "Nah, you made so much noise, I thought I was following Bigfoot." "Don't joke about that." Vel's grin faded slightly. "You were really just going to jump through that thing, head first, without thinking?" Snorting in response, Eric took in the state of his brother. He was dressed in nice clothes that were not at all appropriate for the woods. His shoulder-length hair had been pulled back into a tail at the nape of his neck, and his hands were tucked into the pockets of a blazer he was sure belonged to their father. Obviously, his sibling had not planned on a nighttime excursion into the woods. That reminder of their dad irked him. Also the torn skin of his palm from the tree that caught his balance, and he grumbled. Eric turned away with a haughty sniff, focusing on the shifting portal instead. "What do you want?" "I'm here to make sure you don't do something stupid." Bell caught himself with a shake of his head. "Well, stupider." He grumbled a response. Vel sighed. The man's been gone for 14 years, Eric. Can't you let it go? Eric had reminded himself, with a wince, that it wasn't his fault their dad had left. He had only been 12 at the time. But the whole of his absence remained, and it ate away at their family still. I didn't ask you to come with me. Yeah, but Mom did. Vel pulled his hands from his pockets to fold them over his chest. We both know you won't last out here roughing it. There are bugs outside, you know. He brushed a spider off his sleeve with emphasis. A shiver of fear tore through Eric. Anything with more than 4 legs freaked him out. That's why he carried at least 6 cans of bug repellent in his pack. But the siren song of the portal caressed his attention, lulling him back to it. This was too important. It urged him forward a step, and then another. If he could find their father, he could fix everything. He would be unburdened from the woes of the eldest child, and he'd be free to live his life how he wanted. Lost in his thoughts, he wasn't aware of how close he had been beckoned to the gateway until he felt a hand at his elbow, and Eric turned to see his brother standing beside him. He grimaced. Go home. Nope. Eric sighed, his eyes moving back to the glowing surface only inches from his outstretched fingers. He made to take the plunge when that touch on his arm turned to a grip. He glanced over his shoulder. Will you promise that if we can't find Dad in a reasonable amount of time, we'll come back? Vel's hand relaxed. I left something very important to be here tonight. He stared up at his big brother for a moment, then reached out and clicked off his headlamp. Promise me. At the stubborn gleam in Vel's eyes, Eric knew there would be no dissuading him. He let out another long, exasperated sigh and returned his attention to the glittering portal that hung silently before him, a beacon of light in the darkness. Fine. His fingers tickled the surface, and ripples danced across it, shifting the colors and distorting the image of what lay beyond. Let's go find Dad. Chapter 1. Paragon of Manliness. Thick, juicy slabs of crispy bacon and sizzling sausage links, a garden's worth of ripe red tomatoes roasted and split, fluffy mountains of scrambled eggs. All of it came together on 4 separate plates spread out on the table before him. And appreciating the heavenly beauty of such a sight, Brig let out a hungry grunt. Measuring carefully, he reverently sprinkled just the right amount of pepper over it, then pulled the top hat from his head, rubbing a meaty hand over his smooth scalp as he struggled to imagine what else this masterpiece needed. He repositioned the accoutrement back into place and did a happy little wiggle in his seat, gingerly lifting his fork. He was just about to stab into the mountain of sausages when, Yo, Brig, check this out! A filthy, yellowed parchment was slapped atop his bacon and sausages. Eyes bugging wide, he snatched the flyer from his plate, grumbling to see it had already soaked up a decent amount of the grease. Attila! When his best friend plopped into the empty stool across from him, his army green tactical poncho flapped dangerously close to the plate of eggs, and Brig narrowed his eyes. He pointed his silverware at the lanky man. I thought I told you not to interrupt me when I'm eating. Well, technically... Attila's face split with a cheeky grin as he dug a finger beneath his floppy cowboy hat to scratch just above his eye patch. You hadn't started eating yet. He stared longingly down at the food spread out on the table, but he learned, long ago, never take anything edible from Brig. Braver men had lost fingers. Well, whatever this is... He skewered the flyer with his fork and flung it back towards his buddy. It's gonna have to wait. I'm starving, and I haven't eaten since that stale jerky 3 days ago. Brig twiddled his fork, turning his gaze back to the plate of hot, delicious food with a look that would make most women blush. "This," Attila caught the parchment and slid it, right side up, across the only empty space on the table, "is our ticket to payday. A cruise straight into Cash City. The start of the slippery slope of stardom." Brig frowned, prying his eyes from his plate of sausage to stare down at the flyer. Printed over yellowing parchment was an amorphous shape of inky tar, a creature that hauled itself from the swamps of the abyssal labyrinths, a place out west that few dared to tread and even fewer returned from. This one wore the jawless skull of a human as its own head, and a set of royal antlers to complete its horrifying visage. The words, "Wanted, Dead," were stamped in bold letters at the header of the poster. He groaned, nearly shoving the page back towards his friend.
"Dang it, Attila, ain't no such thing as an abyss walker. And even if it were real, the things are supposed to be nigh impossible to hunt, let alone capture or kill. And that's assuming—" His words stopped, his impressive mustache twitching as he spotted the bounty. Next to the word reward was 10,000 CCCs. Attila grinned and reached across the table, jabbing a dirty finger onto the paper hard enough to leave smudge marks. "Just look at that payday!" Brig thought about it, then flicked the wanted poster away. "I ain't suicidal. 10,000 cash, credits, or casings isn't enough to get me to hunt one of those creatures."
Attila snorted a laugh and reached over to slap the other man's giant bicep. "Please, we can easily achieve this. I mean, look at us. You look like a forklift and a protein shake had a baby, and I'm a paragon of manliness." He flexed his inconsiderable muscles to emphasize. He belted out another laugh at the sight of crimson blooming on his friend's dark-skinned cheeks. A man bumped their table, carrying a large cask on one shoulder. He looked down and shook his head.
"That bounty been on the Barker board for almost a year now. Ain't no one dumb enough to go after it."
Attila gave a one-eyed wink to the unwashed, uneducated, and undentured man. "Well, I, good sir, am. Now, if you don't mind, myself and this well-dressed wrecking ball are having a private conversation." As the barkeep left, shaking his head, Attila turned back to his friend, that grin on his face wide and slightly manic. "Just think about it. 10,000 is a lot of moolah. Enough to buy you a new set of suspenders." He reached out and snapped one of the elastic bands like a guitar string. Brig grunted.
Or fix that junker of yours."
"Hey, you leave Priscilla out of this." He lifted his fork once more, stabbing a sausage, and aimed it for his mouth, but the slamming of the barred doors against the wall silenced the saloon. Attila looked up to see a rowdy gang of men barge inside, clambering over one another to find the largest table near the fireplace. Several of their group split off, some heading to the counter to order their drinks, and some moving to the dartboard, pulling their daggers from their belts and piling handfuls of bullets on the nearest table. He licked his lips hungrily as he pushed out of his seat and moved toward them, clapping his friend on the shoulder.
"Hey!"
Brig hissed, scrabbling to stop the merc.
"What the hell do you think you're doing?"
"Don't worry. Nothing nefarious. You just sit here and enjoy your food." He reached beneath his poncho and retrieved a small handful of chopped greens, tossing them onto the eggs. "I'm gonna get us some ammo." Brig started to protest the rain of pocket chives, then shrugged and dove into his meal with gusto without complaint. Having successfully distracted his friend, Attila approached the rowdy gang. Judging by the acrid scent of alcohol and BO that wafted through his nostrils, this group had been up since the previous night, drinking the other bars in 3 Hub dry. The Bitter Bullet was widely acclaimed as the worst drinking hole in town, and thereby, from the merc's point of view, the best. Their mugs might not be clean, but they were large. He smiled, his one eye flickering towards the bar's serving wench and owner, Ginger, as she stabbed a knife toward a hand that grabbed at her ample backside. Yep, he liked large mugs as much as the next man. He sauntered up to the group of ne'er-do-wells. "So, we playing Drunken Daggers, boys?" A game that resembled beer pong mixed with darts, Drunken Daggers used knives instead and often resulted in far more casualties. A game that Attila absolutely shined at. He grinned at the guys, watching their sloppy throws miss the giant hand-painted target entirely. "Oh, judging by how none of you are actually hitting the bullseye, you must be enjoying a different game." The nearest man stopped, dagger still poised mid-throw, and turned. He narrowed his tiny eyes, nearly invisible beneath the thickest caterpillar eyebrows Attila had ever seen.
"Of course we're playing Drunken Daggers. You got the stones to join in?"
The man threw his dagger without ever turning back to face the board.
6 case and ante.
Attila grimaced as he watched the weapon shatter through the glass pane of a window, not even on the same wall as the target, but recovered quickly. If they were already this sloshed, he'd earn himself some ammo and a few rounds. Attila cleared his throat, deposited his handful of bullets onto the table, and stepped up next to the man. "Veronica, knife me!" Extending his arm, a metal device shot out of his sleeve, depositing a wicked-looking dagger into his outstretched palm. It was clearly a modified Bowie knife, but the boys didn't seem to care. He squinted his one eye, leveled the weapon in his hand, giving it a flip to hold the point of the blade, and flicked it with expert form. With a flash of glinting steel, the knife sunk deep into the haphazardly painted bullseye on the second tier, nearest the center. The trio of men groaned, counting out Attila's wager in bullets, and shoved them towards his pile. He grinned as he watched the others walk to the various corners of the bar to retrieve their own knives. This was going to be a very profitable night. As the morning wore on, his pile of ammo swelled with each round, and the other men resorted to buying him shots of tequila, hoping that if they inebriated him enough, he'd start losing. This was a common strategy. As per the rules, any drink offered had to be consumed. A perk of the game that made it so much fun and so dangerous. He glanced over his shoulder, catching his friend's gaze, and gave him a silly little drunken thumbs up. Rig had nearly finished his third plate, meaning this would have to be his last round. The man could put a shop vac to shame with how he sucked down food. He lined up the shot, blinking blearily and swaying as he aimed the knife once again. He shuffled forward to throw, but he tripped on his own left foot and stumbled, the weapon flying gracelessly from his fingers. Wide-eyed, Attila watched the knife sail in the wrong direction, aiming to soar through the hole in the window, when it inexplicably veered back towards the board as if suddenly grabbed by invisible hands. It sunk deep into that bright red circle at the center, and he let out a nervous chuckle.
"Hey!"
Caterpillar Brow rounded on him, his bald head growing red with anger.
"You was cheating!"
Pin-drop silence blossomed in the bar, and Attila could only smile. "Would you believe it was divine intervention?" He began heading for the board, keeping his grinning face on the trio of men.
"No, but you might want to start praying."
Caterpillar Brow cracked knuckles the size of walnuts.
"Nobody cheats the baker's dozen."
Baker's dozen? Attila felt his already pale face grow paler. The Baker's Dozen was a gang family in the literal sense. Ma Julie Baker, Big Daddy Jerome Baker, and their 9 Baker children. Since there were only 11 of them, it was widely debated why they called themselves the Baker's Dozen. Whether it was because they couldn't accurately count that high on 2 hands, or if that was just their collective IQ. In that moment, Attila realized the group of men he had been playing with were mostly women. It was hard to tell at first glance, however, because the Baker's family tree had a healthy dose of troll lineage, and everyone knew female trolls were the largest of the species. Attila refocused his thoughts in time to see Caterpillar Brow charging straight for him. With mere seconds to react, he did the only thing he could think of. He jumped out the window, using his arm to brace against the glass and causing the Baker child to slam into the bullseye like a drunken bull. He leaned in through the gaping wound in the wall and yelled, "Brig! Time to go!"
Nope, I haven't had my eggs yet.
The muscular man didn't look up from his meal, polishing off the last slice of dry bread, using it to soak up the remaining grease on the plate.
You started this, you can finish it.
A meaty hand slammed down on his table, shattering it to splinters, but Brig was faster. His breakfast was saved by his quick reflexes, and he looked up from his meal to see the owner of that meaty hand. A large, gray-skinned behemoth stood before him, growling angrily.
Miss Jezebel, I presume?
Now, typically, quarter trolls weren't known for reaching such heights, but the top of her pigtails tickled the rafters of the bar, and he forced a smile on his face. Jezebel was the youngest of the Baker girls, easily recognizable by the fact she had been given a double dose of the family looks. The saloon doors burst open, and Attila sprinted inside. "Get a doggy bag!" In a mad dash, he slid the ammo he had won off the card table into a small pouch attached to his belt. "We gotta go!" Caterpillar Brow, more commonly known as Little Jeremy Baker, climbed unsteadily to his feet and rubbed at the swelling red mark on his forehead.
"Well, what y'all waiting for? Get him!"
Now, if there was one thing the inhabitants of Three Hub and Bitter Bullet Goers enjoyed, it was a rowdy, mid-morning brawl, especially if it meant throwing hands at any members of the Baker's Dozen. The family had a habit of poaching other mercs' bounties after the hard part was already done. The bar wench Ginger managed to dump her tray of beer across the heads of those bakers still seated at the table as the bartender, Crazy Eye Carl, began slamming heads on the counter. Meanwhile, Miss Romeo pulled vials of sweet-smelling toxins from within the ruffles of her crimson dress, slamming them into the faces of the ugliest of the Baker sisters. Chairs went flying, the cacophony of splintering wood rang out, and in a feat of Baker marksmanship, a body flew through the air and slammed into the wall mere inches from the window, spraying them all with bits of wood and plaster. Still, Briggs sat in his chair, holding his breakfast and debating the best way to finish it, when Jezebel flipped the plate in his hand. His eggs soared straight up into the air and then landed spectacularly onto the ground as a squishy, yellow lump. Attila, arms wrapped around the necks of Little Jerry Baker II and Little Jerry Baker III, looked up and paused his attempts to choke the boys out. Uh-oh.
Thems.
Brig began to shake, rage filling his every bone, all 204 of them.
Was?
He dropped from his stool, standing to his full height, never hoping to match the troll's gaze, but that didn't deter him.
My!
He balled his meaty hands into fists, pulling them back.
Eggs!
Blinking, Jezebel chuckled.
Tiny man, gonna stomp you like a bug.
Attila winced as the carnage commenced. The sound someone makes when their kneecaps are shattered is rather particular.
Just once, I wish you'd behave long enough for me to eat in peace and quiet,
Brig grumbled as he gingerly touched his black eye. He winced as he hopped down from the passenger seat of their rugged, heavily modified, chopped-up old tow truck. Having escaped the brawl without a scratch, Attila flicked the grass-skirt bauble girl on the dash before he did the same, though it wasn't much of a hop for him, his long legs touching dirt before he even left the seat. He didn't respond to his buddy's jab. There was no point, really. Angry at the loss of a meal, Brig would stew for the remainder of the day over it, and any response from him would just send the big man down the rabbit hole once more. The two met around the side of the truck, staring up at the imposing beast of the Ashlands, the dead wood forest. The town of Three Hub lay 20 miles behind them, the ruined city of Nova a 3-day drive north, and this 37,000-acre forest sat between them. 50 years ago, war had broken out over the world. Nobody remembered what had started it, the hows and whys fading to dust with time. But this continent was one of the first to be devastated with bombs. Biological, ecological, nuclear, everything down to the kitchen sink had been tossed their way. When the dust settled, the attacks had scarred more than just the land. The forest of redwood trees, somehow miraculously standing, had suffered a fate worse than salted earth. Something wicked caused them to rot in place. Now, the skeletal frames of the pre-war titans were being slowly consumed by mushrooms, colonies of mutated fungi that devoured the monolithic forest, transforming the wood into something fungal with each passing year. Brig swallowed hard as he stared up at the impossibly tall trees. Here, on the outreaches of the forest, they still resembled redwoods, only with gnarled branches and twisting trunks. But signs of their replacements could be seen. A shiver traveled along his spine as he caught the snap of twigs or the crunch of bones from within.
Tell me again why we're doing this.
10,000 big ones, Attila replied with a smile. He unfurled the wanted poster he'd swiped on the way out and stared down at the creature that grinned back up at him. And bragging rights.
We're mercs, Attila, not monster capturers.
Well, after this haul, we can officially add cryptid hunters to our resume. Attila tucked the flyer into one of the many pockets of his poncho and shoved his hands against his hips, staring into the unwelcoming silence of the forest. He waited a breath before he clapped his buddy on the shoulder. After you.
No.
Brig twisted out from the gangly merc's grip enough to shove the flat of his hand into the man's spine and pushed.
Be my guest.
Attila danced away from the forest's edge, circling back behind his friend and adjusting the tall top hat on the man's head. Age before beauty.
You're older than me.
The two continued shuffling and shying away from the trees until a rumble and a flurry of snapped twigs silenced their arguments. They stared at one another, then into the darkness, at something that broke up the gray light that filtered in from the canopy of fungus. Adjusting his poncho on his shoulders, Attila took a brave step forward, then another. 5 steps closer to the forest's edge, when he glanced over his shoulder to see Brig had remained rooted in place. What are you waiting for? If I have to do this all by myself, I'm claiming the 10,000 CCCs without you.
That's fine.
Brig scratched furiously at the thick mustache beneath his nose. After a moment, he voiced a concern that had been rattling around in his mind.
What if there's aliens in there? Or lizard folk? Or
a shadow government? Attila's flat voice responded as he rolled his one eye. This is a forest. Like I told you, aliens only snatch people from farms, the lizard folk live underground, and the shadow government is on the other continent right now. He smiled. It's perfectly safe. Doubt, disbelief, skepticism, whatever you called it, Brig had it in spades.
I ain't taking any chances. No way I'm getting abducted again.
Think of how many breakfasts 10,000 big ones could buy.
With bacon?
And flapjacks. Brig licked his lips in response.
You know I love my flapjacks. Ain't nobody make 'em like Mama, though.
His stomach gave a hungry rumble, conceding to the temptation. Well, then we'll use the 10 grand to go visit her. Brig looked up at his gangly friend.
Promise?
Absolutely! Do it for your mama.
For Mama.
For Mama! Brig pumped his fists, starting to bounce from foot to foot.
For Mama!
Hell yeah! Attila slapped the hyped-up man on his meaty bowling ball of a shoulder. Now go in there and make her proud. Before he could talk himself out of it, Brig stomped over to the threshold where the forest met desert and into the darkened silence. Then, just as quickly, stopped, causing Attila to bump into him.
Hear that?
Attila cocked an ear. No?
Exactly!
Birds had long since fled this area, for lack of food or the lack of desire to be food, but their absence heightened the sound of everything else. Every dropped twig, every rustle in the bush, every snap of a hollowed-out branch.
It's freaking me out, man.
Attila straightened out, stepped in front of his buddy, and flung out his arm. The pneumatic extractor in his sleeve extended and offered him a weapon scrounged from the depths of his poncho. A plasma grenade popped into his hand, causing him to blink in surprise. He'd had no idea that was even in there. He gave a sinister chuckle, entertaining the idea for a split second, then remembered they had to produce a corpse, and he shook his head. Something a little less explodey, please, Veronica. The extra limb snatched away the grenade and quickly replaced it with the same knife he had been caught cheating with. He began twirling it in his fingers and made to step over a fallen mushroom when Brig's hand snatched him back a step. His friend put a meaty finger to his lips and nodded to something several dozen yards in front of them. Lifting his eye patch, the darkness of the forest gave way to Attila's night vision, his hidden cybernetic peeper glowing purple. Something came into focus. Something large. Something hungry. A grime golem. A creature born from the fallout of biological weapons. It moved around on two legs like an ape, knuckles dragging through the debris. Theories ran wild of their origins. Everything from transfigured Bigfoots to mutated escaped zoo gorillas. A colony of inky mushrooms grew along its spine and formed a hideous crown atop its skull. Two sets of red eyes glowed in the dark, allowing it to scrounge out any nutrients it could find. It paused its noisy chewing on the bone from a long-dead animal to sniff the air. Attila quickly checked his pits, unsure how recently he had showered. Uh-oh.
My balls shrivel when you say uh-oh.
4 red eyes spun in the dark and landed on them, followed by a deep, rumbling growl as it rose up and began to slap its chest. The noise repeated like a macabre song beat out on a drum.
Attila, I think we've overstayed our welcome. Let's head back to the Bitter Bullet and find some other bounty.
Don't worry. I got this. Attila's grin grew a little manic as his voice dropped. Brig groaned. He knew that look. Whipping his arm, Attila sent the blade flipping through the air. It cartwheeled in a wide curve around one of the trees, then smacked right into the head of the bellowing mushroom ape. Handle first. The pommel exploded into a small shower of gyroscopic gears and targeting circuitry. Then the remaining bit of useless metal fell impotently at the grime golem's gigantic feet. Uh-oh.
Damn it, Attila, you are banned from using that phrase.
The grime golem bellowed out another thunderous roar, a mouthful of large, flat teeth catching the dim light, and it gave chase. Knuckles slammed into the ground, leaving craters and propelling it toward them like a rocket. The pair screamed, in a totally manly fashion, and turned on their heels to run. They stumbled over roots and overturned logs, Attila pulling his friend this way and that as they zigzagged through the trees in an attempt to lose the beast that pounded along behind them. Hang on! I'm sure I've got just the thing in here! His pneumatic extractor plunged into the depths of his gear to bless him with nose hair trimmers?
Hey, those are mine!
Unless you want to shave this thing's snot shoot, I don't see how it's relevant. They stumbled into a blanket of red moss that tangled in their boots, tripping them, and they spilled painfully into a shallow ravine. Attila groaned right alongside Brig as they stared up at a sliver of open sky and gigantic mushroom caps. The grime golem came to a stop at the edge, staring down at them from 10 feet above. It's okay. I don't think it will attack. Attila scratched at his eye patch, sucking in a deep gulp of air to catch his breath. It's normally a pack hunter, and there's only one of them. As 2 more faces peered over the ravine edge, Brig slowly turned to stare at his friend. A 4th and 5th grime golem joined the others, and he narrowed his eyes to deadly slits. Do you ever get tired of being wrong? Attila opened his mouth, poised to respond, but it snapped shut when one of the mushroom monkeys disappeared, yanked from sight, followed by a high-pitched primal scream, cut off with a sickening crunch. The other stink apes looked around, their walnut brains coming to slow understanding one of their number was missing. Something swift, inky black, and terrifying erupted into view. Its amorphous body slid over the thrashing forms of the grime golems, swallowing them into itself the way slowly oozing magma consumes everything in its path. Each angry roar or terrified whine was silenced with a meaty snap or gnashing pop of limbs being torn free. A scuffle of noises drew the attention of the Abyss Walker, and it lunged into motion, chasing down its prey. The pair of mercs heard a shrill scream, and then the weight of silence descended over them. Brig and Attila remained rooted, eyes wide, mouths closed, and butt cheeks clenched. "Attila," Brig whispered, "I don't think I want them flapjacks anymore." The pair slowly began to climb out of the ravine, and as they breached the top, they spotted their bounty as it digested the fungal creatures without a care. One long arm held the lower half of a grime golem, while the other appendage rummaged inside its own stomach, fishing out a partially digested rib to cast it aside. The bone clacked off a tree and smacked Attila smartly on the head. Ow! The word had left him without it even registering, and all 3 of them froze. A jawless human skull floating in black gelatin slowly turned its empty gaze toward them, its pair of stag horns cocked to one side. Uh-oh. Hey guys, I know we promised you something different, but with everything going on, Lesley and I decided to take a step back from the current storyline and do something we've wanted to do for a number of years. Of Monsters and Mushrooms was only ever supposed to be a short story at first, and as such, we felt the plot really suffered. So we decided to rewrite it. This should fix any plot holes and let us focus on comedy for a bit. We really hope you enjoy this reimagined version of Monsters and Mushrooms by Lesley Herron. Stay tuned for the adventure, which is shaping up to be much crazier than the first time around.
Ha! In the truck! Go! Go! Good gravy on a pickle sandwich. That was too close.
Oh, man! I love the bitter bullet.
Dang it, Attila. We nearly died in there.
I had him right where I wanted him. Did you see me in there?
Correction. I nearly died. And no, I didn't. Where the heck were you?
I was offering my services to Ginger.
No wonder she banned us again. Damn, that minigun of hers is scary. So now we're out of a place to crash, I'm out a meal, and to make matters even more spectacular, we made enemies of the baker's dozen.
More like the baker's 8 now.
What the heck, Attila?
What? It wasn't my fault. They just happened to fall right on my knife.
3 separate times.
It's statistically possible.
Attila, Do we need to have the talk again?
Hey, I wonder what's on the radio.
Don't change the subject while I'm talking to...
I'm telling you, it was aliens. Why would
hey.
anybody believe me?
It's my favorite program. Fascinating. And what did they do?
They took me up in their ship and they made me slow dance with them.